The year is 1869. Picture a road deep in the Ozarks, Missouri hills, heavy with mist, the soil soaked from weeks of unrelenting rain. The trees bend like watchmen, their twisted branches forming a canopy that chokes out light. A lone traveler approaches a place locals whisper about, but never stay in after dark. The Poison Springs Inn. On the surface, it looks like a refuge. A warm hearth for the weary, a tavern for strangers passing through, but the innkeepers knew something the rest of the world refused to see. Travelers carrying gold, cash, or secrets were not guests. They were prey. The story was almost erased, buried beneath county records and yellowed newsprint. But fragments remain, ledgers that list names crossed out in red ink, receipts for supplies never delivered, and whispered testimonies from men who swore the ground itself reeked of poison near the springs. These innkeepers weren't simple criminals. They were architects of a system, a machine of death and silence that fed on the flow of fortune from westward expansion. The Civil War had ended just 4 years before. The Ozarks were raw, scarred land, lawless and broken. Bands of deserters, raiders and mercenaries moved like shadows through the hills, and ordinary law was powerless to stop them. But what happened inside the Poison Springs Inn was something more calculated, more chilling than banditry. Guests were welcomed with warmth, seated with drink, fed until their guard dropped, and then, when night fell, they were vanished, swallowed not by wilderness but by men who had mastered the art of turning hospitality into a trap. You were never supposed to hear this story. That's why it was buried, why records went missing, why newspapers refused to follow it beyond a few grisly details. Because the innkeepers weren't working alone. They had protection. Men in offices, men in pulpits, men with badges. Every seed was buried in the soil of Poison Springs, left behind not only a stolen fortune, but also silence purchased in blood. The question that haunts the Ozarks even now is not how many died here, but how deep the conspiracy ran. Was it a family secret, a criminal brotherhood, or was the Poison Springs Inn just one node in a larger web of corruption stretching from Missouri to Washington itself? This is not folklore. This is the kind of history they will tell you is too dangerous to repeat, and once you hear it, you won't see the idea of safety the same way again. By the spring of 1869, the Poison Springs Inn had gained a reputation that was equal parts comfort and unease. To the exhausted traveler, it was a beacon, lamplight spilling from the windows, the smell of stew and whiskey promising relief after days of mud and silence. But to the locals, it was a house with a heartbeat too loud. They knew that men entered and never returned. They whispered that the springs nearby turned red when the rains were heavy, as if the earth itself was bleeding. The innkeepers, 2 brothers, Thomas and Elijah Harper, were Irish immigrants who had arrived in the Ozarks at the close of the Civil War. At first they appeared no different from the countless settlers carving out survival in hostile land. Thomas the elder wore civility like armor, soft-spoken, articulate, capable of making strangers believe he was the only trustworthy soul for miles. Elijah was different, larger, coarser, with eyes that studied every guest like inventory. Together they perfected a ritual of disarming the wary and binding the careless. The trick wasn't violence, it was patience. A prospector carrying dust from California or Nevada was often paranoid, armed and unpredictable. To kill him outright was dangerous, but to poison him, subtle, untraceable, that was genius. Rumors claim the Harpers learned to lace their whiskey with tinctures drawn from the very springs that gave the inn its name. Travelers would laugh, relax, then grow sluggish, their words slurring, their eyes heavy. By the time the lanterns burned low, they were gone, dragged through hidden doors into cellars where ledgers were written and bodies were prepared for disposal. Every disappearance carried the same pattern: men traveling alone or in pairs, wealthy, unanchored. Their horses were sometimes found days later, riderless. Their names were etched in inn records but never in town registries. The Harpers were careful, too careful. Supplies purchased with stolen gold were filtered through third parties. Sheriff's deputies who asked questions were silenced with free drinks, favors, and whispers of useful intelligence. But the poison wasn't only in the cups they served, it was in the system they wove. Ministers vouched for their character, merchants praised their generosity, and in the end, the community, hungry for the prosperity these men brought, chose not to see. Silence became currency, complicity the cost of survival. Every nightmare begins with a door you were never meant to open. The Poison Springs Inn was that door, and in 1869 the Harper brothers were about to step beyond murder into something even darker. Control. The Harper brothers understood something most killers never do. Death alone doesn't build power. Control of perception does, and that was their true talent, not just poisoning bodies but poisoning belief. When a traveler disappeared, the Harpers already had the story prepared. To one man they would say, yes, he left for Springfield just before dawn. To another, he took the southern route, anxious to make Arkansas before the rains. The lies were never grand. They were small, forgettable, and crafted to scatter suspicion into fragments too weak to connect. But what unsettled the few who dared whisper against them was the consistency of their ledger. Hidden beneath the inn's floorboards were journals that read more like intelligence reports than tavern records, not just names and dates, but habits, possessions, psychological sketches, a prospector's weakness for liquor noted in careful script, a merchant's habit of traveling with hidden cash stitched into his saddle, a minister's talk of tithes carried in silver coins. Every man who passed through Poison Springs was reduced to a profile, a set of vulnerabilities to be exploited. The brothers didn't work in isolation. That was the real horror. Teamsters who transported goods for the inn conveniently overlooked wagon loads that seemed too heavy. Local officials pocketed envelopes filled with currency that had once jingled in a dead man's purse. Even the county coroner, when bodies did surface, bloated and pale from the springs, was quick to declare drowning or misadventure, never murder. One woman came closest to breaking the silence. Her name was Abigail Mercer, the widow of a Union captain, traveling east after visiting family in Kansas. When she failed to reach her home in St. Louis, her brother traced her last steps. He found her horse sold in Springfield under another name, her belongings scattered. He demanded answers, but what he received instead was a warning. Be careful where you point suspicion. Some truths here are heavier than one man can lift. That warning wasn't metaphor, it was law. To accuse the Harpers was to accuse the very machinery of the Ozarks, because too many hands were already stained with their profits. This is why history buried them, not because the crimes were unspeakable, but because they were too useful. The innkeepers fed more than themselves, they fed a system, and once a community decides that blood is worth the prosperity it brings, the murders stop being isolated crimes. They become ritual. By the autumn of 1869, whispers about the Harper brothers had turned into something more dangerous than rumor. Patterns. The Ozarks are a place of memory. People notice when routes go silent, when once busy trails no longer deliver their travelers. Farmers saw fewer strangers passing with packs of gold dust. Blacksmiths noticed abandoned horses brought in by men with no business owning them. And yet, every time suspicion began to gather, the Harpers struck first with hospitality. They donated lumber for church repairs. They gave credit to poor farmers when no other merchant would. They hosted holiday feasts where whiskey flowed freely, making sure their neighbors left full and grateful. They built what all predators build when they intend to kill without consequence: trust. But trust is a fragile thing, and the Harper brothers had learned during the war how easily it can be manufactured. Thomas had served briefly as a quartermaster, dealing in supplies, rations, and bribes. Elijah had learned in the infantry that men rarely question the strong hand that keeps them alive. Together they brought that battlefield psychology into their business. At Poison Springs Inn, a man didn't just drink, he confessed. He spilled fears about bandits, maps to hidden claims, confessions of fortunes carried in saddlebags. The Harpers made men feel as though they were speaking into a well of secrecy. They weren't. Every word was captured, weighed, and marked. And then came the springs themselves, sulphurous, bitter, their waters never trusted by locals. Legend said the Osage avoided them, calling the pools cursed. Whether by chance or design, the Harpers used that reputation to mask their crimes. When bloated corpses surfaced in the waters, the whispers said the springs killed them, not men. Poison became myth, and myth became shield. But here lies the darker truth. The inn was never just a murder site. It was a training ground. Young drifters, orphans of war, men with no loyalty but hunger, were recruited to dig graves, carry bodies, deliver messages. The Harpers didn't just kill, they cultivated a network, one that reached beyond the inn into the valleys and towns. And that is what terrified those few who saw through the charm. This was no innkeeper's greed. This was the blueprint of a dynasty of control. What the Harpers built at Poison Springs wasn't meant to vanish with them. It was designed to outlive them. And that's why, even after their names were scrubbed from polite county records, the shadows of their methods still lingered in the Ozarks for decades. Travelers spoke of marked men, not marked by God, but by ledger. If the Harpers recorded your name, you were already half dead. Some lived for weeks after their entry, drinking, laughing, trading stories at the inn. But eventually they were drawn back, by business, by invitation, or by force of circumstance, and then their fate was sealed. The Harper ledger was a prophecy written in ink and greed. One recovered fragment, preserved in the private papers of a local judge, carried a name written twice, first with a simple note, merchant, heavy with coin. Weeks later beneath it, another line, disposed, root covered. To read that page was to see not a crime of passion, but a cold bureaucracy of murder. And still people benefited. Inns along the trails that should have fallen to competition survived because the Harpers funneled wealth into their hands. County sheriffs rode horses once owned by vanished men. Local elections were tipped by donations the Harpers distributed to keep men of silence in power. But not everyone accepted it. A preacher named Samuel Colton refused their gifts. He railed against them from the pulpit, calling Poison Springs a pit of mammon. His congregation dwindled, his barn burned, and when his wife fell sick from an unexplainable fever, his voice broke. Within months, he left Missouri entirely, and the town buried his warnings as easily as they buried their dead. The lesson was clear. To accuse the Harpers was to exile yourself from your community. Silence became survival, complicity became the law. And in that silence the Harpers thrived. By the winter of 1870 the inn was less a business than a fortress of reputation. Travelers who entered did so blind, locals who stayed away did so willingly, and the springs, dark, sulphurous, forever swallowing what floated to the surface, remained the perfect accomplice. Because the land itself had been chosen well. Poison Springs did not just hide bodies, it swallowed evidence. For years, the Harper brothers ruled Poison Springs with a quiet efficiency that made their crimes nearly invisible. But no system, no matter how well-oiled, is perfect. And the first crack appeared not from lawmen, not from neighbors, but from within their own circle. A drifter named Caleb Rowe had been pulled into their orbit, a half-starved veteran with no family and no future. At first he dug graves and hauled bodies for scraps of coin, but Caleb was clever in a way the Harpers didn't anticipate. He understood that every empire, no matter how cruel, carries within it a point of collapse. And he began to watch. He watched as Thomas Harper carefully inked entries into the ledger. He listened to Elijah rehearse excuses for missing travelers, practicing them like a preacher rehearses scripture. And one night, while the brothers celebrated a profitable killing with whiskey, Caleb stole a glance at the ledger itself. What he saw chilled him. Not just names and profits, but symbols, strange markings beside certain entries. Some were crosses, others circles. A few bore shapes resembling eyes. To Caleb, they looked less like bookkeeping and more like ritual. And maybe that's what broke him. Murder for money was one thing. But murder marked with symbols, That meant the Harpers weren't just feeding greed, they were feeding belief. Caleb fled Poison Springs weeks later. Some say he made it as far as Arkansas before he started talking. In taverns and roadside camps he whispered about the ledger, about the bodies sunk in the sulfur pools, about the inn where a man's words were written down before his death. He spoke of a system, a cult of silence. And those whispers began to spread. But whispers cut both ways. The Harpers heard them too, and unlike the law, unlike the fearful townsfolk, they knew exactly how to deal with betrayal. Caleb Rowe's body was found months late, hanging from a sycamore tree near the border. No boots, no coin, a crude note pinned to his chest, all debts paid. The message was clear, not just to Caleb, but to anyone who thought of speaking against Poison Springs. Yet something had changed. Caleb's story, even in death, refused to vanish. His whispers had already taken root, and once a truth enters the bloodstream of rumor, it cannot be killed so easily. Caleb Rowe's death should have silenced everything. That was the Harper way. Swift, brutal, final, but his whispers had already seeded doubt in places the brothers could not reach. And those seeds drew the attention of men far more dangerous than a single drifter. By the spring of 1871, bounty hunters began to circle the Ozarks, not for justice, but for opportunity. Rumors spread of gold hidden in saddlebags, of silver stashed beneath floorboards, of a ledger worth more than coin itself. The idea of the Harpers' records, proof of killings, names of victims, secret profits, was enough to set men on horseback with rifles across their backs. The law, too, began to stir. A marshal from St. Louis, William Pritchard, took notice of the missing travelers. He had heard Caleb's whispers before the man was silenced. Unlike local sheriffs fattened by Harper coin, Pritchard had nothing to lose in these hills. His letters to Washington, though buried in bureaucracy, spoke of organized disappearances, of a system of predation masked as commerce. But Pritchard wasn't just chasing law. He was chasing ghosts, and in the Ozarks, ghosts fight back. The Harpers adapted quickly. They built alliances with rival gangs, men who owed them favors, men who would gladly mislead bounty hunters for a share of whiskey and coin. They spread false trails, setting fires along routes where hunters camped. More than once, a man who rode into Poison Springs searching for the ledger was found days later with his throat cut, his body dumped where the sulfur stench disguised the reek of death. Yet the cracks widened. The whispers refused to die. A single story in a St. Louis paper, barely half a column, mentioned mysterious vanishings near the sulfur pools. That article was clipped, carried, reprinted in smaller sheets. The Harper name was never written, but the Poison Springs Inn was becoming known, and reputation, once a weapon, was turning against them. For the first time, travelers approached the inn with hesitation. Some refused the drink, suspicious of its bitterness. Others made excuses to camp miles away, preferring wolves to warm beds. The Harpers noticed, their ledger noticed, profits dipped. And when greed begins to suffer, paranoia always follows. Paranoia eats slower than hunger, but it devours more in the end. By the summer of 1871, the Harper brothers were no longer predators waiting in silence. They were hunters flinching at shadows. Thomas the older kept rewriting the ledger late at night. Crosses were doubled, circles erased, whole names scratched out with such fury that the paper tore. Elijah drank more, his charm unraveling into sudden violence. Guests began to notice. What once felt like warm hospitality now carried an edge of menace, like a smile held too long. Then came their first mistake. A wealthy cattleman from Illinois, Jacob Turner, stopped at the inn with 2 hired men. Unlike most travelers, Turner was cautious. He carried no obvious coin, spoke little of his affairs, and refused every drink offered. For 2 nights the Harpers watched, waiting for him to slip, but Turner never did. So Elijah acted rashly. He struck one of Turner's men in the dark, believing him alone. The body was dumped in the springs. But Turner awoke to the silence of missing footsteps. By morning, he confronted the brothers, and for the first time, Poison Springs bled suspicion directly into a survivor. Turner fled before dawn, riding hard toward Springfield. He carried no proof, only fear, only whispers. But that was enough. By the time he reached town, his story was already growing teeth. He spoke of poisoned drinks, of laughter echoing over the springs, of ledger books filled with names never seen again. He claimed his man had been murdered, though he could not show the body. The Harpers tried to control it. They bribed, they threatened, they called Turner a drunk. But the damage was done. Someone had survived the inn, someone had spoken. And that changed everything. Because up until then, the Harper brothers had thrived on silence, on missing voices. Now there was a living witness, and living witnesses are far more dangerous than the dead. From that moment their empire shifted, no longer invisible, no longer untouchable. The inn that had been a fortress now became a beacon, drawing hunters, skeptics, and even lawmen toward its sulfur-stained grounds. The cracks were no longer hidden. The ledger was beginning to unravel them. Once Jacob Turner carried his story out of Poison Springs, the Harper brothers lost the one shield that had protected them from the beginning: doubt. Before, people whispered. Now they wondered. And wondering turns quickly to watching. The Ozarks began to feel heavier with strangers. Some were lawmen, some opportunists, some just curious men drawn by the smell of scandal. They lingered at taverns, asking too many questions. They traced wagon trails to the inn. They compared notes with families who'd lost kin on the road. The Harpers could bribe and silence only so many before the web grew too wide. Marshal William Pritchard was among them. He'd heard Turner's account, and, unlike the locals, he believed it. Where others saw a frightened cattleman, Pritchard saw corroboration. He began assembling his own ledger, a counter-ledger. Missing names, missing dates, stories that lined up too neatly. He knew he needed proof, but proof was secondary. The pattern was already damning. The brothers responded the only way they knew how, with control. Travelers who asked too many questions simply vanished. Hunters who rode too close to the springs never returned. One bounty man, James Drury, was found floating in the sulfur pools, his revolver rusted to his belt. The message was unmistakable. Come close, and you will join the others. But even fear has its limits. For every man silenced, two more appeared. Pritchard pressed on, writing to Washington that Poison Springs was a place where law does not walk, where commerce is paid in blood. His words might have vanished into another drawer of forgotten reports, but Turner's testimony kept them alive. And here's the irony. The Harpers' paranoia only fueled the fire. Their sudden violence, their reckless killings, their desperation to erase suspicion, all of it created exactly what they feared most. A trail. By the end of that year, the Harper brothers were no longer invisible predators. They were marked men. Their names weren't yet printed in bold ink across Missouri papers, but they were being spoken in parlors, in offices, in the halls of law. And once a name escapes the shadows, it can't ever be dragged fully back. The springs still hid their dead, but the living had begun to circle. The Harper brothers had built their reign on silence, but silence had turned against them. Each missing man was now a question hanging in the air, and questions breed patterns. By the winter of 1871, their empire was no longer hidden. It was cornered. And in that corner, one thing resurfaced with sharper menace than any rumor. The ledger. Marshal Pritchard finally secured fragments of testimony from a farmhand who had once carried crates into the inn cellar. He described shelves of books, some ordinary account records, others marked with strange sigils, crosses, circles, and what he called watching eyes. These were not just financial tallies. They were something older, something ritualistic. The ledger seemed to function on two levels. One, a cold inventory of theft and death, profit noted against each victim. Two, a secret language known only to the brothers. Did the symbols mark debts owed to others? Did they represent promises to unseen allies? Or were they talismans of belief, the kind born in the shadows of war, where men clutch at power they don't understand? What unsettled Pritchard most was this: the ledger suggested order. The killings weren't random. They followed a sequence, as though victims were chosen to fulfill a system. Wealthy merchants, lonely widows, prospectors flush with dust, all reduced to symbols. It wasn't murder for survival. It was murder as designed. Meanwhile, locals who once smiled at the brothers began to avoid them. Farmers stopped trading at the inn. Wagons rerouted even if it meant longer miles. And those who did stop came armed, their hands never straying far from their belts. The inn's laughter turned brittle, its doors heavier. The Harpers were still feared, but they were no longer trusted. And paranoia has a taste. It seeps into food, into drink, into the very air of a place. Guests who survived the night spoke of unease, of whispers under the floorboards, of sudden silences in the dining room, of Elijah's eyes watching too closely, too long. By then, the Harpers must have known the ledger would be their undoing. They tried to move it, to bury it deeper in the cellars, but too many had heard of it. Too many wanted it. It was no longer their tool. It had become their curse. The book that once gave them power was now the thing that painted a target on their backs. And every hunter knows you can kill a man, but you cannot kill the story that binds him. By early 1872, Poison Springs was no longer just an inn on a back road. It was a stage, and everyone circling it, the law, the bounty hunters, the drifters chasing rumor, wanted one thing: the ledger. To the law, it was proof. To rival gangs, it was a map of fortune, pointing toward caches of wealth stripped from the dead. To the Harpers, it was survival, the last thread holding their empire together. The brothers fought to keep control. Thomas tightened his routines, rewriting the ledger each night as though rearranging words could rearrange fate. Elijah grew reckless, drinking himself into rages, brandishing pistols at guests who asked too many questions. Once, when a peddler pressed him about missing kin, Elijah slammed the man's face into the table and snarled, "You'll vanish too if your mouth doesn't close." The peddler never returned home. But their violence only sharpened the hunt. Rival gangs began circling like wolves. One crew from Arkansas tried storming the inn outright, believing the ledger and its wealth were hidden in the cellar. The Harpers slaughtered them, dumping the bodies into the sulfur pools, but the attempt revealed what they feared. The ledger was no longer a secret. It was bait. Marshal Pritchard, hearing of the failed raid, pressed harder. He filed reports calling Poison Springs a nest of organized murderers and petitioned for federal backing. Washington moved slowly, but his words were beginning to reach the ears of men who cared less about justice than about leverage. And in the towns around the Ozarks, people lived with double vision. By day they traded, farmed, prayed. By night they whispered of screams carried on the wind from the inn, of riders who vanished on the road, of the sulfur pools bubbling as though something beneath was restless. Children were told never to go near the springs. Men sat in taverns with their backs to the wall. Everyone knew. No one acted. Because complicity is a softer noose than a rope, and the Harpers had tied it around every neck. Still, a shift was coming. The brothers weren't untouchable anymore. Their ledger wasn't just a book, it was a wound, and the more it bled into rumor, the more scavengers gathered to feed. The Harpers could kill men, they could bury bodies, but they couldn't bury the story, and the story was beginning to consume them. The first confrontation didn't come with fanfare or warrants. It came quietly, on a grey morning when the fog clung low over the Ozark hills. Marshal William Pritchard rode into Poison Springs with only 2 deputies at his side, their rifles wrapped in oilcloth to hide the shine of steel. They didn't come to arrest. They came to observe, to breathe the air, to see the ground, to step inside the inn that had already swallowed so many. Pritchard wanted to look the Harpers in the eye and confirm what his ledger of vanishings had already told him, that he was standing on the threshold of a slaughterhouse disguised as hospitality. Inside, the inn smelled of wood smoke and whiskey, but beneath it lingered another scent, sulfur, faint yet unshakable. Elijah greeted them with his practiced smile, the same one that had disarmed so many travelers before. Thomas stayed in the shadows, his gaze fixed, measuring cold. Pritchard asked simple questions. Who had stayed here last week? Where was the peddler reported missing on the Springfield Road? Why did the books of the inn not match the number of beds filled? Elijah answered with charm, Thomas with silence. But charm breaks when pressed, silence condemns when held too long. The deputies saw things too, scratches on the floorboards as though heavy trunks had been dragged into the cellar, a ledger on the counter, ordinary but too clean, pages torn out, entries smoothed over. One deputy swore he heard a muffled sound from beneath the floor, like a moan quickly stifled. Pritchard left without drawing his pistol. He knew the inn was guilty, but guilt and proof are not the same. He told his deputies, "This is a house of graves, we'll need more men to open it." The Harpers watched him ride away, their faces tight with something they hadn't felt in years: fear. For the first time, Law had stepped inside Poison Springs and walked out, it alive. For the first time, the brothers were not the only ones keeping record. The ledger of the Harpers and the counter-ledger of Pritchard were now on a collision course, and between them lay the fate of everyone complicit in the silence. The storm had finally reached the inn's door. That night, the Harpers didn't sleep. The walls of Poison Springs held their secrets, but for the first time those walls felt thin, like parchment that could be set ablaze by a single spark. Elijah paced the length of the tavern floor, lantern swinging in his hand, muttering about betrayal, about the neighbors who might have whispered too loudly. Thomas sat at the table, a knife in his palm, spinning it slowly, his silence heavier than words. "He saw too much," Elijah hissed. The marshal looked at me as though he already knew. "He'll come back with men, rifles, shovels. Do you understand what that means?" Thomas finally spoke, his voice low, flat. "Then we bury deeper." But Elijah shook his head. "No. No amount of earth will hide this. If they dig, they will find bones. If they question, they will find liars. We must move before he does." They began naming names. The sheriff who drank their whiskey, the preacher who swore by their good Christian reputation, the merchants who helped wash blood money into clean currency. If the marshal pressed, any of them might crack. "Eliminate the weak," Thomas said, his knife now pressed against the table, the wood creaking beneath his grip. Elijah's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "Not yet. Fear first. Remind them who feeds this town, who built its church, who pays for its harvest festivals. If we fall, they fall with us. We'll make them protect us, or we'll make them pay." That was the Harpers' genius. Corruption turned into leverage. The very men who could testify against them had been bought, dirtied, entangled. Now the threat of exposure was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Outside, the night was unnaturally still. Locals swore the springs themselves had soured, bubbling black where once they ran clear. Some whispered it was the ground rejecting what had been buried in it, the weight of too many corpses pressing up from below. But the Harpers didn't care about superstition, they cared about survival, and with Pritchard's shadow now looming over them, they began plotting something far darker than murder, a counterstrike against the law itself. Because once men like the Harpers feel cornered, they don't wait for judgment. They create a new order, one written not in ink, but in fear. Marshal Pritchard didn't ride straight back to Springfield. He knew better than to return with half a story and no proof. The Ozarks had swallowed plenty of lawmen who moved too quickly. Instead, he stopped in small towns along the route, listening more than speaking, planting questions like seeds, and waiting to see what sprouted. And what sprouted was fear. Innkeepers went pale when asked about the Harpers. Merchants stammered when pressed about their accounts. A preacher in Cassville slammed his door when Pritchard mentioned the Poison Springs Inn, as though the very words could curse him. Everywhere he went, silence seemed bought and paid for, stitched tight with Harper coin and Harper threats. But silence also leaks. In hushed corners, over cheap whiskey, farmers' wives spoke of sons who had vanished on the road. Prospectors who never reached their families. Pritchard listened, wrote nothing, but memorized everything. By the time he reached Springfield, he had the bones of a case. Not proof, but a pattern so sharp it cut anyone who looked too closely. He gathered his most trusted men, veterans who'd seen the worst of war and still rode with steady hands. "This won't be a simple arrest," he warned them. "This will be excavation. We're digging through lies, through earth, through hell itself, and once we start, we don't stop until the truth is in daylight." Word spread faster than he liked. By autumn, whispers ran ahead of him, carrying rumors that the federal marshal was preparing to bring down the Harpers. The inn's power began to falter. Men who once toasted Elijah with whiskey now avoided his gaze. Women who once prayed beside Thomas at church crossed themselves when he walked past. The brothers felt it. Poison Springs had shifted. The air was thicker, the nights quieter, the patrons fewer. Elijah cursed the marshal in his prayers, but Thomas simply sharpens at his knife, saying nothing, waiting for the knock on the door that would mean war. In Springfield, Pritchard studied maps by lantern light. He traced the trail from Joplin to Poison Springs again and again, his finger pausing at the inn like it was a tumor that needed cutting out. "This place isn't just an inn," he told his deputies. "It's a wound, and if we don't cauterize it, it'll poison the whole of Missouri." The descent was coming. The Harpers knew it. Pritchard knew it. And soon the earth itself would bear witness. The night before Marshal Pritchard made his move, the Harpers sealed the inn like a fortress. Windows were shuttered, lanterns dimmed. The bar, once a place of rowdy laughter, now held rifles lined across the counter as if the inn itself had become a soldier waiting for the order to fire. Elijah paced the floorboards, boots pounding like a drum of defiance. His Bible lay open on the table, but his prayers had soured into curses. "The Lord sends trials," he growled to the handful of loyal patrons still lingering, "but he also sends his chosen men to endure them. And we are chosen." His words carried no warmth, only a fevered edge that made the listeners drink hard to drown their unease. Thomas, silent as ever, worked in the cellar. He checked the tunnels, tightened ropes, sharpened blades. He wasn't praying, and he wasn't drinking. He was preparing. Some whispered he had buried barrels of powder beneath the floor, ready to bring the whole inn down if lawmen pressed too far. Outside, Poison Springs was eerily still. The forest seemed to hold its breath. No travelers came down the dirt road. No wagons rattled past. It was as if the land itself knew the reckoning was near. In Springfield, Pritchard assembled his deputies. They were 12 in number, men who carried scars from Gettysburg and Shiloh, men who had no taste for another war but no patience for predators either. Around the table the marshal laid down his plan. "We ride at dawn, no fanfare, no warning. We surround the inn, cut off every exit, and drag those devils out if we must." One deputy, older than the rest, spat into the fire. "Marshal, you sure about this? Every man in these hills says the Harpers don't die easy." Pritchard's gaze hardened. "Then we'll find out how hard they die." As dawn bled into the horizon, 12 riders mounted up, their silhouettes sharp against the pale light. Each knew what Poison Springs meant: an end to fear or an end to them. Hooves struck the earth in rhythm, a drumbeat of justice marching toward the inn. Inside, Elijah looked up from his Bible. He smiled, a thin, cracked smile. "They're coming," he whispered. And Thomas, wiping the edge of his blade clean on his sleeve, finally spoke. Just 2 words, but they chilled Elijah more than any sermon. "Let them." The sun broke over Poison Springs like a blade, slicing the mist that clung to the hills. Marshal Pritchard and his 12 deputies rode in silence, their horses' hooves muffled in the damp earth. They split at the tree line, circling wide, moving like predators around a wounded animal. By the time the inn came into view, its sagging roof dark against the pale sky, it was already surrounded. Pritchard dismounted first. He studied the building, its shutters drawn tight, its chimney dead cold. The place looked less like a business and more like a coffin waiting to be nailed shut. He drew a deep breath, loosened his revolver, and signaled to his men. They moved into position, some at the road, others slipping behind the stable, 2 crouched at the well. No exit was left unguarded. Dot. Then came the silence. Dot. Even the birds seemed to have fled. The only sound was the creak of leather and the marshal's boots crunching toward the door. He raised his hand, fist clenched, every rifle lifted, every man held his breath. Dot. The knock was thunderous. "By authority of the United States," Pritchard called, his voice carrying across the hollow. "Elijah Harper, Thomas Harper. Step outside. You are charged with murder, theft, and crimes too foul to name. Come out, and you will be spared the rope if justice permits." For a long moment, nothing, just the hollow echo of his demand. Dot. Then, from inside, came laughter. Low at first, then louder, breaking into two voices, the preacher's rasp and the brother's growl, braided together like a hymn twisted into mockery. "You think you bring justice," Elijah's voice rang from behind the door, "but you bring only more blood. Ours or yours, it makes no difference." A shot cracked from the upstairs window, splintering the wood inches from Pritchard's head. The deputies fired back, glass shattering, smoke pouring, horses screamed, rearing against their lines. Dot. The siege had begun. Dot inside. Elijah raised his Bible with one hand and a revolver with the other, shouting verses over the din. Thomas moved wordless through the shadows, setting traps, firing shots, his blade gleaming when the light caught it. Dot. Outside, Pritchard shouted orders, his men returning fire in disciplined bursts. But even as bullets tore into the inn's shell, a chill ran through him. He realized the Harpers hadn't sealed themselves in to hide. They'd sealed themselves in to fight to the last breath. Gunfire tore through the morning like a storm that refused to end. Bullets punched holes in the inn's siding, shattered bottles behind the bar, and carved splinters from beams thick as a man's arm. Smoke coiled in every room until the air itself felt poisoned. Marshal Pritchard crouched behind a water trough, his revolver hot in his hand. His deputies held their ground, firing in bursts, disciplined but relentless. Yet for every shot they poured into the inn, another came back with equal fury. It was as if the walls themselves were fighting. Inside. Elijah raged. He stood in the dining hall, Bible in one hand, pistol in the other, screaming verses drowned in gunfire. To his remaining loyalists, 3 men too far gone in debt and fear to run, his voice carried the weight of a prophet. "The Lord is with us," he bellowed, even as blood streaked his cheek from a grazing shot. "And if he is with us, who can stand against us?" But Thomas wasn't wasting words. He was below, moving through the tunnels dug years earlier, his lantern throwing jagged shadows along the damp stone. He checked each hidden exit, some leading into the woods, others into long-forgotten mine shafts. In one chamber, a stack of crates waited, powder, shot, tools of war, enough to hold the marshals off for days if needed. And deeper still, something darker, a pit lined with bones, scraps of clothing, rusted chains still bolted to stone. It wasn't just storage, it was a tomb. Thomas stood there for a long moment, his blade resting on his shoulder, as if drawing strength from the silence of the dead. Then he turned back, his face lit only by the lantern flame, and began dragging barrels toward the stairwell. Above. Pritchard felt the tide shifting. His men were steady, but the inn was built like a bunker. Every window became a rifle's mouth, every shadow hid a shot, and though they were lawmen, I were trained, the Harpers fought with the madness of men who had no future to lose. The marshal signaled to 2 deputies, "Get the torches. If we can't drag them out, we'll burn them out." But even as he gave the order, the ground beneath his feet rumbled. A low, unnatural tremor that seemed to come from the earth itself. His blood went cold. Thomas. Harper wasn't just defending the inn. He was preparing to bring the whole place down. The rumble grew louder, shaking dust from the rafters and rattling glasses that hadn't already been shattered. Marshal Pritchard froze, listening, his instincts screaming that this was no ordinary firefight. He had seen battlefields collapse under artillery fire, had felt the ground buckle when mines were detonated beneath marching regiments. This was the same sound, the earth itself preparing to give way. Inside the inn, Elijah roared scripture between shots, his voice hoarse, his body trembling from blood loss. But beneath his frenzy, a flicker of unease cracked through. He could hear his brother moving in the cellar, dragging barrels, rolling iron-bound crates. Elijah didn't need to look to know what they were. Powder, enough to erase the building, the marshals, and maybe the town itself. "Elijah!" Thomas's voice thundered up the stairwell for the first time all morning. "Hold them as long as you can. When it falls for all." The preacher's face went pale. For all his fire, for all his sermons about destiny and chosen trials, he had never believed it would end like this. Not in flame and rubble, not buried in his own pulpit of sin. But Thomas had always been the true heart of their darkness. And Thomas had no fear of ending in fire. Pritchard barked orders, dragging his men back from the walls, waving them toward the tree line. "Out! Now! He's mining the damned place!" The deputies scattered, some firing as they ran, others dragging wounded comrades across the dirt. Smoke poured from the windows, thicker now, acrid and bitter with the stench of powder. Then came the first blast. It wasn't the whole cache, just one barrel, lit to test the marshal's nerve. The explosion split the rear wall, hurling timber into the clearing, sending men and horses reeling. Flames licked up the siding, hungrily devouring the inn's skeleton. From the cellar, Thomas dragged another barrel into position, his face grim, his movements mechanical. Elijah staggered down to meet him, Bible still clutched in his shaking hand. "Brother," he rasped, "this isn't God's will, this is damnation." Thomas met his eyes, cold and unblinking. "Then damnation it is." Above them, the roof groaned. Outside, Pritchard steadied himself against a tree, smoke stinging his eyes. He realized with a sick weight in his chest that this wasn't a siege anymore. It was a burial. Flames climbed the walls of the Poison Springs Inn, painting the dawn in orange and black. The roof sagged under the weight of smoke, timbers groaning like dying men. Yet still the gunfire cracked, defiant, as though the building itself refused to surrender. Marshal Pritchard crouched at the edge of the clearing, coughing against the acrid air. His deputies fanned out behind him, rifles ready, but he knew they weren't fighting men anymore. They were fighting the blaze, the collapse, and the madness of two brothers who would not die quietly. Inside, Elijah stood in the dining hall, firelight flickering across his bloodied face. His sermons had collapsed into hoarse muttering, scraps of psalms and curses tangled together. Smoke stung his eyes, and yet he clutched his Bible tighter, as if the charred leather could anchor him to heaven, even as hell opened beneath his feet. Thomas moved with grim precision. He hauled the last barrel into the center of the cellar, jammed a fuse deep into the powder, and lit it with steady hands. There was no trembling, no hesitation. He was a man who had accepted his own burial, and worse, intended to take the world down with him. "Elijah," he called up, his voice carrying through the roar of fire. "Time's done." The preacher staggered to the cellar steps, staring at the fuse hissing toward the barrel. His lips trembled, his scripture faltered. In that final instant, he saw the truth he had spent his life denying. Thomas wasn't a soldier of God. He was death in flesh, and Elijah had followed him into damnation. Outside, Pritchard's eyes widened as smoke burst from the cellar windows in thick, furious plumes. He shouted for his men to fall back, waving them into the trees. Horses screamed, deputies stumbled through the brush. The marshal himself dove behind a fallen log as the world convulsed. The ground shook. The inn erupted. The expo. Ocean tore the building from its foundation, a thunderclap that split the morning sky. Timbers and stone rained down like shrapnel. Fire rolled upward in a pillar, black smoke twisting heavenward, as if dragging every sin the Harpers had ever committed with it. When the roar finally ebbed, only ruins remained. A blackened husk, still smoldering, still spitting sparks. No hymn, no prayer, no voice of Elijah. Harper rose from the wreckage. No blade flashed in Thomas's hand. Poison Springs had swallowed them whole. But Pritchard, staring into the rubble, knew one thing with terrible certainty: the earth never keeps its secrets buried for long. By the time the flames quieted, half the forest had gathered at the edge of Poison Springs. Farmers, townsfolk, even children crept close, drawn by the column of smoke rising like a signal fire. They whispered as they stared at the ruins, some in relief, others in awe, and many in fear that burned hotter than the embers still glowing in the rubble. Marshal Pritchard stood at the wreckage with soot caked on his face, his coat torn from flying debris. His deputies worked silently behind him, dragging beams aside, searching for bodies, yet every time they thought they'd found one of the Harpers, it was only another blackened loyalist, charred beyond recognition. Elijah's Bible was recovered near the foundation, half-burned, pages curled and fused together. But of Elijah himself, nothing. And Thomas? No body, no blade. Only ash and shadows. Rumors began before the smoke cleared. Some swore they saw a figure walking from the back of the inn as the fire consumed it, tall, silent, moving into the trees. Others whispered that the tunnels beneath the inn ran deeper than anyone imagined, and that Thomas Harper had carved himself a path straight into the earth. The preacher's absence stoked darker tales. Mothers hissed that Elijah's voice still echoed in the hollow, carried on the wind at night. Travelers claimed to hear sermons from the trees, sermons that made their horses rear and their stomachs twist. A few swore the well water at Poison Springs ran bitter after the fire, as if the ground itself had been cursed. Pritchard tried to silence these whispers. He declared the Harpers dead, the inn destroyed, justice served. But even he, as he stared into the smoking foundation, felt the weight of doubt. No bones, no bodies, just fire, ash, and legend. By winter the inn was gone, buried beneath snow and silence. But the story spread beyond Missouri, carried by wagons, railroads, and riverboats. The Harper brothers became phantoms of the frontier, men who had carved sermons in blood, men who chose fire over capture, men who refused even death's embrace. And so Poison Springs remained, a scar on the land. No one rebuilt there, no one drew water from the spring again. It was left to rot, to darken, to breathe stories into every passerby, brave or foolish enough to come close. The law closed its books, but the land kept its memory. And the people kept their fear. The law ended its work at Poison Springs, but the story had only begun. Within weeks, the ruins of the inn were no longer a crime scene. They were a pilgrimage. Travelers from neighboring counties crept up the road not to trade, but to stare at the charred foundation. They spoke in hushed tones, as though the earth itself might overhear. Legends took root faster than weeds. Some said Elijah's voice still carried on the wind, a cracked sermon that drifted through the pines after midnight. Others swore that Thomas had been seen on the back roads at dusk, blade glinting, face pale as ash. No one agreed on the details, but everyone agreed on one thing. The Harpers weren't finished. Stories twisted with every retelling. Farmers claimed their livestock refused to drink from Poison Springs, stamping and snorting until driven away. A trapper swore he found fresh footprints in the snow near the ruins, bare feet, larger than any man's. A young girl from Springfield returned from the site pale and speechless, clutching a charred scrap of paper with a verse written on it that no Bible contained. Marshal Pritchard tried to smother the tales, but even he wasn't free of them. At night, he dreamed of the cellar, of bones rattling beneath his boots, of a fuse burning slow in the dark. Sometimes he woke certain he smelled smoke in his room, though no fire burned. He told no one, not even his deputies. But he kept the half-burned Bible locked in his desk, its pages fused together like flesh. The frontier was a land that thrived on fear as much as faith, and the Harpers became both. For some they were demons, proof that evil walked in daylight. For others, they were martyrs, men who defied the government to their last breath. For most, they were a curse, a reminder that not even fire could cleanse the stains left by their hands. Parents warned their children, never walk the Poison Springs road after sundown. Hunters swore off the forest. Even preachers, bold from their pulpits, avoided the hollow when dusk settled. The inn was gone, but the Harpers had become something worse than men. They had become a legend. By spring, the ruins of Poison Springs had vanished beneath weeds and wild growth, yet the legend only deepened, spreading far beyond the Ozarks. Wagon drivers whispered about the inn that wouldn't die, Riverboat gamblers swapped stories of a preacher who cursed God in fire, and mothers hushed crying children by threatening to send them to the Harpers. But Marshal Pritchard couldn't leave the hollow behind. He returned alone more than once, riding the same road he'd ridden with 12 men, his boots crunching the same soil that had trembled under fire. Each time he swore he'd find proof, bones, steel, something to prove the brothers were truly dead. Each time he left with nothing but the same gnawing question: had he destroyed them or only buried them deeper? The half-burned Bible haunted him most. Its pages, warped and blackened, were fused into grotesque shapes, yet sometimes when he opened it in the lantern light, he swore he saw words forming in the margins, verses that weren't scripture at all, verses that twisted promises into threats. He stopped showing it to anyone, stopped speaking of it, but he couldn't stop reading. And then came the dreams. At first, only smoke and fire, then faces, Elijah's wild-eyed glare, Thomas's silent, bloodless stare. Finally, a cellar. Always the cellar. He would wake with the taste of powder in his throat and the echo of chains clinking in his ears. Once, in the dead of night, he thought he heard footsteps outside his window. Heavy. Bare. He armed himself constantly. Even in town, even in daylight, he carried 2 pistols at his side. His deputies noticed, so did the townsfolk. Whispers spread that the marshal who brought down the Harpers was losing his grip, but none dared confront him, not when his eyes grew darker by the week, not when he snapped at shadows like they were flesh and blood. Still, he couldn't stay away. He hollow called to him. Some nights he rode there and sat among the ashes until dawn. One morning a deputy followed at a distance and swore he saw Pritchard speaking, not praying, not muttering, but speaking as though someone stood across from him in the ruins. The deputy never followed again. Because in that same hollow he swore he heard a second voice answer back. The people of Missouri began to treat Poison Springs as a place apart from the world, a wound that would not close. Travelers avoided the road entirely, even if it meant days of detour. Mail carriers swore their horses balked and refused to pass the hollow after dark. Farmers stopped hunting the woods nearby, claiming the deer there bled black when struck. By summer, no one dared draw from the spring. Its water, once clear, had turned cloudy, thick with a metallic taste. Children whispered that it ran with the blood of the Harpers, cursed forever. Preachers in the county condemned the place from their pulpits, but even they crossed themselves when asked to walk near it. And yet, for all the fear, stories grew bolder. Some said Elijah had been seen in the trees, his burned Bible still glowing with embers, preaching to shadows only he could see. Others swore Thomas's knife had been found wedged into a tree trunk, fresh sap bleeding around the blade. A few claimed entire wagons vanished if they camped too close to the ruins, their wheels leaving tracks that ended at the inn's foundation, and nowhere else. Marshal Pritchard fought these stories publicly, insisting the Harpers were dead and buried. But privately, he was unraveling. He had taken to carrying the burned Bible in his coat, and deputies noticed him thumbing through its fused pages, lips moving soundlessly. More than once he rode alone to Poison Springs, sitting among the blackened beams until nightfall, staring at the ground like it held an answer only he could hear. One evening, a tavern keeper claimed he saw the marshal ride back through Springfield with ash smeared on his face, his eyes glazed and distant. Another time, a deputy swore Pritchard returned from the hollow with his hands cut and bloodied, though he never said on what. The town began to wonder if the Harpers were truly gone, or if they had found a new vessel. For when Pritchard spoke now, his voice sometimes carried the cadence of Elijah's sermons, and when he stood silent, eyes unblinking, he bore the same weight as Thomas in the cellar, patient, cold, waiting. Poison Springs had not been cleansed. It had only spread. Word of Poison Springs did not stay caged in the Ozarks. Wagon trains heading west carried whispers of the inn that devoured men, the brothers who poisoned and prayed, and the lawmen who went mad, chasing them. By the winter of 1870, tales of the Harpers were being told in saloons in Kansas, mining camps in Colorado, even among cattlemen pushing herds along the Chisholm Trail. Each retelling twisted the brothers further into legend. In some versions, Elijah became a demon preacher who baptized travelers in poison water before burying them alive. In others, Thomas was said to have carved maps into the bones of his victims, selling their skeletons to secret societies. Some even claimed the Harpers never died at all, that their bodies had been burned but their spirits had seeped into the ground, turning the spring into a portal for their return. These stories fed something darker. Strangers began arriving in Missouri not to avoid the cursed site, but to seek it. Occultists from St. Louis traveled to the hollow, leaving tokens at the ruined foundation. A Confederate widow brought her dead husband's uniform and buried it in the ash, claiming Elijah's ghost promised her vengeance against Union men. There were even rumors of secret gatherings by candlelight, men with covered faces drinking from the spring in hopes of inheriting the Harper brothers' power. Marshal Pritchard tried to suppress it, but his authority was slipping. Each attempt to wall off the hollow only made people more curious. When he posted guards, they reported voices rising from the ground, chanting sermons in a tongue no one knew. When he ordered the ruins dismantled, his men fled mid-task, claiming the soil bled when they struck it with shovels. By 1871, Poison Springs was no longer just a crime scene. It had become a shrine. Not to justice, not to truth, but to corruption, sanctified in blood. Travelers came not to rest, but to test themselves, to see if they could stand where others had vanished. The inn was gone, but the myth was alive, breathing, mutating. And in every story, one phrase remained constant. The Harpers had promised to return, not in flesh, but in influence. Wherever greed outweighed law, wherever the vulnerable were devoured by those claiming authority, the Harper's shadow stretched. It was no longer about an inn in Missouri, it was about the sickness in America itself. By the spring of 1872, the land around Poison Springs had become more than a haunted hollow. It was a mirror, reflecting back the truth most men refused to face. Corruption was not a sickness of the frontier, it was the lifeblood of the nation itself. The Harper brothers had not created it, they had simply named it, clothed it in scripture and hospitality, and shown the world how easily men would kneel when promised safety, profit, or salvation. Marshal Pritchard was no longer seen in Springfield except in fragments. Whispers of him wandering the roads at night, pale and gaunt, as if sleeplessness had eaten him from the inside out. Some swore they saw him praying at the spring, his voice rising and falling with Elijah's cadence, repeating words that no Bible contained. Others claimed he was carving strange symbols into the bark of trees around the hollow, his blood staining the knife. When he finally resurfaced in town, it was not as the lawman people remembered. Standing in the courthouse square, he preached to a gathering crowd. His words had the rhythm of a sermon but the venom of Thomas's cold warnings. He spoke of America's destiny, of gold and empire, of the need for men to be culled like weak cattle so that the strong might inherit the earth. And as he spoke, the people did not hear Pritchard. They heard the Harper brothers speaking through him, their corruption having passed like an infection from soil to man, from man to system. That night, the courthouse doors were found marked with blackened handprints. No one saw Pritchard again, but the legend claimed he had walked back into the hollow, Bible in one hand, knife in the other, and laid himself down where the inn once stood. Some said the ground swallowed him. Others swore he became the spring itself, a voice in the water calling men to drink. From then on, Poison Springs was untouchable. Federal surveyor who tried to map it abandoned their work. Businessmen who dreamed of draining it for farmland found their investors dead within weeks. It became a forbidden place, not because of law, but because men understood instinctively that stepping into it meant stepping out of themselves and never returning. The Harper brothers were gone, but they had not been defeated. They had been absorbed into the very structure of power. And that is why the inn was never rebuilt. Some truths are too dangerous to bury. Stand at the edge of Poison Springs today, and the silence itself feels alive. The wind does not move the trees the way it should. Birds fall quiet as though they remember. The water still rises from the black soil, carrying whispers, carrying the weight of every oath, every scream, every body the land has taken. Travelers who stumble too close speak of hearing hymns sung by a congregation that no longer exists. Others hear a marshal's voice calling them by name, as if the hollow has studied their bloodline and knows where they belong. Locals warn outsiders not to camp there, not to drink, not even to linger. But the warning is never shouted. It is passed in half-tones, in a neighbor's lowered voice, in the way a store clerk avoids your eyes when you mention the springs. Because everyone knows that speaking of it too openly is an invitation. The Harper brothers may be gone, but their design lingers in the air like smoke from a fire that never quite burned out. And here is the truth. No historian dares publish. The sickness did not stay in Arkansas. Men who drank from the spring carried it with them. They rode trains, they signed laws, they built banks and cities. The hunger that began in one hollow spread through the veins of a nation. Every time you hear of fortunes made from nothing, of laws bent to protect the few against the many, of faith twisted into a weapon, you are hearing the echo of Poison Springs. Which leaves the question no man can answer. When you leave this story behind, are you safe? Or has the hollow already touched you, through a phrase, a shadow, a name you cannot shake? Perhaps that is why the spring has never dried, because stories themselves are vessels. And now the story is in you. Now that you've heard it, you cannot unhear it. The hollow knows your name. When the night is quiet, listen closely, and you'll know if it has already chosen you.